I heard you wanted an advanced React project, so in this video, we're going to be creating an advanced note-taking app that has filtering, categories, Markdown support, full routing, deleting, editing, updating, everything you could think of inside of this application. It has it, and it's all going to be written in React using TypeScript, so this is the perfect advanced project for your resume. There is nothing worse than getting an email like this. You know your site's broken but have no idea how to fix it. But with today's video sponsor Highlight, this is a problem of the past. That's because Highlight is not only an error tracking system, but it also gives you a replay of exactly what users did on your site to cause these errors, which means when you get emails like this, you can just go into Highlight, look at the replay, and see exactly what the user did, and you can fix that bug in no time. Highlight integrates into pretty much any framework you can think of, such as React or Vue, in just a couple lines of code, and with those few lines of code, you're going to be getting full access into things like dev tools, logs, network requests for every single session that a user takes on your page, which makes it so easy to track all those different errors. The best part about Highlight is it makes detecting those errors so easy so you can fix them before you have tons of churn on your site. And if you're interested in trying out Highlight yourself, you're going to want to use the link down in the description below. And if you enter the coupon code WebDevSimplified, all one word, you're going to get a 2-month free trial instead of the normal 1-month free trial. Just make sure you do that within 6 months of this video going live. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. As you can see, this is the demo of what we're going to build out in this application. So you can see we have full Markdown support for the body of all of our different nodes. They can all have a title. We can put different tags, and we can even add new tags. For example, I can create a new tag right here, and now that's adding that new tag. So if I go back here, you can see we have a brand new tag with the title of new. And we can come in here, we can filter by different things. So I could search for just this has article. I could filter by tags. I could filter by labels and tags. For example, I could say like this to get just that article. So a lot of that, I can edit all of my different tags. So if I put a 2 on the end of React, now all my React tags have that 2 on the end of them. So it's super flexible with what you can do. And we're going to be building out all of this in this video using TypeScript. Now to get started with what I have on the left side of my screen here, all I did was I ran the command npm create vite. So it'll look just like this. npm create vite, and then you just go through all the steps that ask you, say that you want to do a React application in TypeScript, and that's going to give you the exact same code I have here, minus a few things. I just essentially removed some of the stuff we don't actually need, so we just have these really simple files right here. If we look, you can see that this application is running, and it just has the text hi being printed out. Now, in order to create this application, we're going to be using React Router for all of our routing, and we're going to be using Bootstrap for all of our styling. So I just want to import those libraries by saying npm I React Bootstrap, and Bootstrap, that's going to install those libraries for Bootstrap for us. And we also need React Router. So we can just type in React Router DOM. I hit enter, and that's going to download the different libraries that we're going to be using for this project. And in order to use Bootstrap, we need to import that local Bootstrap file, which is just bootstrap/dist/css/bootstrap.min.css. That's going to give us the CSS for Bootstrap. And already, if we look over here when we save, you'll notice that there's some slight differences because Bootstrap has some default styling that is applied right here. So the very first thing I want to do is get our router set up for React Router. So what we can do is we can come in here with the browser router. And we just want to essentially wrap our application inside of our browser router. That gives us access to routing inside of React Router. And then in our app, we actually just need to use that router. So we can come in here and we can wrap everything inside of a routes component, just like this. Make sure I import routes. We'll just come up here, import routes from React Router DOM. Now we can just get rid of this high text for now, so we just have our routes. And if you're unfamiliar with React Router, we're going to be using some fairly basic stuff in this video, but I do have a full React Router crash course. I'll link in the cards and description for you. Now inside of here, we want to define our different routes. So each one of those is going to have a route like that. Route, there we go. And each one of these routes, we need to give a path. In our case, let's just do our home path for now, which is just going to have a slash like this. We'll make this self-closing for now, because we can define an element, and that is what we're going to render. For now, let's just say we're going to render out the text hi inside of an h1. So if we're at that slash route, it's going to render out hi like this. So if we refresh our page, you can see it's rendering out the text hi, just like we had before. Now the next thing I want to render out is a new path. So it's slash new. It's going to give us to a different thing. So we're just going to put the text new inside of here. This will say home, for example. So now if we go to slash new, it's going to render the text new. But if we go to a URL that doesn't exist, you're going to notice we just get a blank page. I want to fix that. So we're going to create a route that the path is equal to star. That'll match literally everything. So if we type in something that doesn't exist, it'll match this route here. And for our element, what I want to do is I just want to use the navigate element, which is built into React Router. So we can just come up here. We can say navigate like that. And this navigate is going to have a to field, and I just want to navigate back to the home page. So if I just close this off and save, you're going to see immediately we get navigated back to the home page. And if I try to go somewhere that doesn't exist, again, it just redirects me back to the home page, which is perfect. Now the final two routes that we're going to need both start with /id because they're going to be for for viewing a note and for editing a note. So the path here is going to be at /id, just like that. And instead of giving this a specific element, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to put routes inside of here, and each one of these routes are going to be nested inside this route. So if I say index here, that's going to match this path right here, which is just /id. So this is going to be, for example, our show path. So we can come in here, h1, which just says show, and I can do the exact same thing, just copy this down. And this one is going to have a path, which is going to be /edit. So we can just come in here with edit, and that's going to be /id/edit. And this will say edit, just like that. So now if I come in here, and let's just say I put the ID 1, now it's going to say show. If I put the ID/edit, now we're on the edit page. So this allows me to go through all the different pages of our application, which is exactly what we want. Now the last thing I want to do is just wrap this entire thing inside of a container. So we can say container, and this is coming from Bootstrap, and this is just some styling for our container. And we can give it a class here, which is my4. That's just going to give us some margin on the top and bottom as well. So now you can see that this just spaces things out a little bit better, which is really nice. Now that we have our basic shell of all the different paths in our application, the first thing I want to focus on is this new route, because obviously we can't view any notes unless we can create some notes. So let's be able to create some notes here. So instead of just passing in h1, I'm going to pass it a component, which we're going to call new note. Just self-close that like this, and let's create that file. So we'll say new note.tsx, export function new note, just like that. So now if I just import that over here, you can see that everything should be working fine. And if we go to that new route, it's going to render out new note. But of course, we need to make sure we return something from here. So let's just return an h1 that says hi, just so we know where we are. So if we go to /new, it'll now print out that text hi, so everything is linking together properly. Now inside of here, obviously we want to do a little more than just render out an h1, but we do want to render an h1, and that'll just say new note. So we know we're on the new note page. And I'm going to give it a class, which is margin bottom 4, just to give us some space on the bottom. Make sure that's a class name. And then below that, we want to render out our form for our new note. But our new note and our edit note are going to be identical. For example, if we click create, you can see we have this form. And if we just go back by clicking cancel and we click on one of these to edit, you can see that the form is exactly the same for both of these. So what I want to do is I just want to make sure that we use the same form component. So I'm going to create a new component here called Note Form. And we'll just close that off for now. And let's create that Note Form. Just like this, export function, Note Form. And now we can use the exact same form for both of our different components that have new as well as editing of our forms. So let's make sure we have all of our inputs and everything working fine. If we come over here, just make sure this says return. And now you can see our form is being rendered, but obviously we should put some JSX in there. So inside of here, we can get rid of this h1 since we don't need it. And instead we can replace it with a form element. And this is coming straight from Bootstrap. Let's just see if we can import that. Yep, React Bootstrap, there we go. And inside of here, what I want to do is I want to use a stack, which again is going to be coming from Bootstrap. I'm going to give it a gap of 4. This is just going to automatically space out our elements from one another in a vertical stack on top of each other. So if we had 3 divs, for example, that said 1, 2, and 3, you can see those space out with some space between them. And depending on the size of our gap, it's going to have more or less space between them. That's all this stack is doing for us. Now inside of our stack, I want to put a row, and inside of that row, I want to have a column, and inside of there, I want to have a form group. That's like the boilerplate code for Bootstrap. And let's make sure that we import our row as well as import our column, just like this. Now inside of our form group, we want to give this a ID so we can hook together our label and our input. So we can use control ID for that. And this is going to be for our title. So we can just put in here our title. And what I want to do inside of here is just put a form.label that says title again. And we're going to want to have a form control. But our form control here is going to be required. Since it's going to be required, we give all of these a title. and we're going to want to give it a value and a ref, but for now we're not going to worry about that because we just want to get the shell of this working. As you can see here, we have our title form, which is looking really good. I want to add another column, and this one is going to be for handling this select box, as you can see over here for our different tags. So this is going to be for our tags, and it's going to have a control ID of tags. If we come over here, you can now see we have an actual input, but we want this to be a select input. Now we could come in here and replace this with a select like this, and it's actually going to give us a select that we could put some options inside of. But if we want a multi-select that looks like this, that allows us to create new things inside of it, that's going to require much more than just a basic select can do. So we're going to be using a library called React Select. So let's just make sure we install that React Select library. And actually, if you want to see a video of me creating a select that's very similar to React Select, I'm going to link that in cards and description for you. It's a really good project as well to add to your resume. But now with that library, we can actually use that React Select. And what I want to do is I want to use a creatable React Select. So up here, I'm going to import creatable React Select. And then what we can do is we can say that it's going to be coming from React Select. And I want to get that from the creatable folder. And all that this creatable version of it allows me to do is it allows me to create tags just like you saw over here. If I type something in, I can click create to create that tag. That's all the creatable version of this allows us to do. So now I can put my creatable React Select inside of here. I'm going to say that it's going to be a multi-select version. So now you can see when we save, it's going to just refresh, and now we have this list. Right now we have no options, but if I wanted, I could create a brand new option, and that's going to work just fine. So we have this creatability already in there, which is great, and we're going to focus on adding more options into it in a little bit, but for now, I want to get the shell of everything done. So just like with the rest of our application, we're going to need another form group for our final body element, and that's going to be on its own row, so we're just going to put that outside of our other row. This one's going to have the ID of Markdown. That's just because this is our Markdown. We're going to give it a label of body. And then our form control here, again, is going to be required. We want to say that it's going to be as a text area so that this can be a large text area. We want to make sure that it's going to have some number of rows. I'm going to set that to 15, a fairly large number. It's just going to make our text box really big. And now if we save, you can see we have this large text box for our body right here. And it is a text area, which is exactly what we want. And this rows field, all that did is make it so our text box is quite large, which is ideally what we want to have. Now, the last thing I want to do is add in our buttons. I'm going to use a stack for that as well, but I can change the direction of my stack to be horizontal. And now what that's going to do is allow me to stack these items side by side in a horizontal direction. So for example, I could get two different buttons. Let's just close this button off, and that's going to say save. And this one is going to say cancel. Let's just make sure we import button just like that. And now we can change our type. For our save button is going to be a submit button, while our normal button here, this is just going to be a type of button. So we make sure it doesn't submit our form, and we want to change the variant of this. So the variant of this is going to be outline secondary. That's going to give it a gray color. If we copy that up to our save button up here, the variant on this one is going to be primary, which is going to give us that solid blue color. So now if we save, you can see we have our buttons right here. Obviously we want them to have some gap. So we're going to say a gap of 2 right here. That's going to give them some space. And also we're going to add a class name on here, which is justify content end. And that's just going to push our buttons all the way to the far right side of our page, which looks a lot better. And that's exactly what we want to do. Now to make this cancel button work, we just want to make it take us back one page. So that's really easy to do with the link tag. We can say we want to go to ... And what that's just going to do is it's going to move us backwards one page. So let's make sure we import this from React Router. And now whenever we click on this cancel button, it's going to bring us back to the previous page we were on, which in our case is the home page. So if first of all, we go to like /1, the show page, and now we go to /new, when we click this cancel, it's going to bring us back to the page we were on before. But you'll notice here it brought us directly to the home page instead of the show page. The reasoning for this is because we're manually typing into our URL, which is kind of overriding all the history. As soon as we start linking between all of our different pages, for example, on this home page, if I add a button to create, and then I click cancel, it'll bring us back to the home page or from other pages. That's all you really need to know. This just brings us back one step. But since when you use manual overriding with your URL, it can't actually go back because there is no back to go to since you manually typed in the URL. So right now with all that done, what we need to do is we need to make it so we can go to our form, and we need to make it so our form actually does something. In order to do that, we're going to be using refs. So I can come all the way up here. I can say we're going to have a title ref, which is equal to useRef. And this useRef is going to start out as a null value, and we're going to give it a specific type, which is an HTML input element, just like that. And that's because this is an input element that we're going to be getting our values from. Same exact thing here for our Markdown ref. This one, instead of being an input element, is going to be a text area. We can say HTML text area element. And now where we have those different elements, for example, our title, I can say our ref here is equal to our title ref, just like that. I can do the same thing down here for our text area. I can say our ref is equal to our text area ref, just like that. And now if I give this a save, and actually I called this Markdown ref, not text area, there we go. Now everything's working and we have information for our title and our body being stored inside of these refs. So if we wanted to, we could set up a handle submit. So we could say on submit is going to be equal to handle submit. And then we can come in here, function, handle submit, which is going to take in that form event. We can just call prevent default on it. And now what we can do is we can actually handle all this information. For example, we can get our title value or our markdown value, and then we can submit that to, our new note page or wherever we want to submit that. So our note form should probably take in some props, and one of those props should be an onSubmit function. Now, this onSubmit function is going to need to take in information related to our note, some type of data for our note. So inside of our app, let's actually create a brand new type, and that type is specifically going to be for note data. So we know just looking at this new note page that all of our notes are going to have a title, which is a string. They're going to have some type of body, or we're going to call it our markdown. That is also going to be a string. And then finally, we're going to have some tags, which I want to be an array of this tag type. So we, of course, need to create a type for tag as well. And this tag type is really simple. It's an ID with a string and a label, which is also a string. That's all there is to our tag. Now our note should also have an ID, but our note data, the specific data from our form, does not have that ID. So let's create another type that is going to be essentially our note data, but with an ID attached to it. So our ID is a string, and we just want to add on all of our note data onto the end of that note type. So all this is doing is giving us a brand new type that adds ID to our existing note data type. Now with that information, we can go back to our note form and we can set up our note form props, just like this. So type note form props is equal to, we're going to have an onSubmit function, and this function is going to take in some data, which is going to be based on our note data. So let's make sure we export that type in here so we can use it. And I'll do the exact same thing with our tag and the exact same thing with our note here. So we can actually use these different types. So I can import our note data. So whenever we submit, it's going to give us note data, and this is going to return to us a void value. So we're going to pass it our note data and expect nothing in return. So here we can call that onSubmit function and we pass it in our note data. In our case, our title, which is our title ref.current.value. We're going to have our markdown, which is our markdown ref.current.value. And then finally, we're going to have our tags, which we're just going to pass an empty array for now, but we're going to figure out how to do that in a second. Now, in order to get rid of these errors, we can just put an exclamation point here at the end. And that's just saying that even though this value could be null, we're saying it's never going to be null. And the reason for that is because we made sure that these values are required. You can see right here, this is required, and right here it's required. So it's always going to have some type of value, which is why we can get array with forcing these to be not null. Now, the last thing I want to do is store our tags. And instead of using a ref for this, we're actually going to be using state for this. So we're going to have our selected tags, set selected tags. That's going to be inside of an array because we're getting that from useState. And this is going to be an array of tag elements. And again, we need to make sure we import that tag element. Start it out as an empty array. Let's just make sure we import useState and we import tag just like that. Now, if we scroll all the way down here to where we're using our creatable React select, what we can do is we can set up a value property and an onChange property. So this value property, we need to pass it an array that has keys for label and for value. So we need to take our selected tags, we need to map it to a brand new value. So for each one of these tags, what I want to do is I want to return an object that has a label property, which is the label from our tag, tag.label. And what I want to do is I want to give it a value, which is our tag.id. The reason we need to do this is just because that's what creatable React select expects for its value. It expects a label and an ID, just like you would expect from an option inside of an array or inside of a select, sorry. And the next thing we need to do is we need to set up our onChange to be able to modify our values. So onChange is going to get passed in an array of tags, but these tags are going to be in the format of the actual onChange, which has a label and a value. So again, we need to map these values from our tag. So what I can do is I can say that we want to set our selected tags. And with our selected tags, we're going to take all of the tags that we have here, and we're just going to map each one of the tags to be the correct value. So we're converting from a label and a value to a label and an ID. So we can return here a label, which is tag.label, and an ID, which is tag.value. So essentially all we're doing with these is we're making sure we're converting from the value the creatable React Select expects to the value that we're actually storing for our type, which is an ID and a string. Now, before we go any further with this new Note form, we need to make quite a few changes to how we're storing our data, because obviously right now we're not storing any data at all. So inside of our app, we want to store some state for our notes, and we want to store some state for our tags. And instead of using, state like this, what I want to do is I want to use local storage just so that we have a way to keep this information persisted. So we're going to use local storage, and this is going to be called notes. And by default, it's going to be an empty array just like this. And we're going to give it a type here, which is going to be raw note array. And in just a second, I'll explain why we're using this raw note by creating the type itself. So if we export a type called raw note, this raw note type is going to be very similar to our note, but instead of storing the tags, we're just going to store the ID of the tag. The reason for this is what happens if we change the value of our tag. Well, I don't want to go into every single note and update that value. I just want to update our tag, which we're storing inside of local storage as well. And then it's going to automatically propagate that change because it knows that the ID is the correct ID. So for our raw note, what I want to do is I want to have an ID, which is a string. And then I want to have some data, so we'll do raw note data as well, just like we did with our normal note. Raw note data, and it's going to be exactly the same, but our tags here, instead of being tags, we're going to call this tag IDs, and it's just going to be an array of strings. So this is going to store the IDs for each one of our tags, and then when we create our notes, we're just going to make sure we check our tag array, which our tags have an ID, and we're going to get the correct value for that tag. This just means that if I update my tag, I don't have to update every single note that I'm storing. I know that as long as the ID remains the same, it'll propagate that change across. So let me just copy this down one more time for our tags, just like this. And this is going to be an array of tags, and we're going to call this tags. Now I'm just going to make these capitalized because it's going to conflict otherwise with the other elements that I have on localhost. So that's just going to fix that problem. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new file for that useLocalStorageHook. And this is just going to be where we store all of our data. So export function use local storage, just like that. And we already know if we look here, it's going to take in a generic type, it's going to take in a label, and it's going to take in a default initial value. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we have a generic type here that it's going to be accepting. We're going to be having a key, which is a string, and we're going to be having an initial value. And that initial value is either going to be of type T, the generic type, or it's going to be a function that is going to return type T. And that's just because when you use state, you can either pass it a function or you can pass it an initial value. Either one is going to work. So we want to make sure this works exactly the same. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to use some local state inside of here. Some use state. So we're going to have value set value equals use state. The type of this state is going to be that generic type we pass in. Make sure I just import use state like that. And inside of here, we're actually going to use the function version of use state because I want to first check to see if this data is in local storage. So we're going to get our JSON value because we're going to store this in local storage using JSON, which is just local storage.getItem of our key. Then what we can do is if our JSON value is equal to null, then what we want to do is do some value. Otherwise, if it's not equal to null, we can just return the parsing of that JSON value. So if for some reason we don't have any value from local storage, then what I want to do is I want to essentially take that data and I want to make sure that I use the initial value passed in. So let me just close out of that real quick. What we can do inside of here is if the type of our initial value is equal to function, that means we need to run the function version of this. Otherwise, we can just return our initial value just like that. So here what we can do is we need to run initial value as a function. So we could say initial value like that, run it as a function and return that, but it's going to give us an error inside of TypeScript because it doesn't know if this is actually a function that we can call, and we don't know that it returns the type of T. So we just need to make sure that we take our initial value and we cast it to this exact type. And this is the type that we put up here for a function. All this code does is it tells TypeScript, hey, this initial value right here is going to be a function that returns the type of T, and then we're going to call that function. If I just make sure I spell initial value correctly and we save, we're now no longer going to get any of those errors. And we have our value and our set value, which down here we can return inside of an array just like this. Now again, we're going to need to type this. So we're going to need to say that, hey, the first value is t, and the second value is just going to have the type of set value. So we're just specifically saying to TypeScript, hey, this array that we're returning is always going to have the first value, which is our type that is t, and the second value is going to be whatever the type of this set value is, just to make sure TypeScript knows what each one of these types are. Now finally, we're going to use a use effect, and that's just going to save our data in local storage every time our value or our key changes. So if our value or our key changes, then we're going to take our local storage and we're going to set the item at that key to the stringified JSON version of our value, just like that. And that's all we need for our useLocalStorageHook. It may be pretty complex, but essentially all we're doing is we're just checking, hey, does the value exist yet? And then every time we change it, just update it. That's it. Super straightforward. So now inside of here, if we import that hook, you can see that should get rid of all of those different errors. And now we have a place to store our notes and a place to store our tags. Now I mentioned that we're storing the raw note data, so we're not actually storing the note tag itself, we're just storing the ID. So I need to actually get the notes with tags to be able to convert my raw note into an actual note. So we can use memo for this, just like this. And with our use memo, what we want to do is return our notes.map each one of our notes. And for each one of these, we're just going to take our entire note object. So everything that was already in there, that's fine. We're going to keep that. And then we're actually going to get some individual tags. So we're going to take our tags and we're going to filter on them. So for each tag, what we're going to do is to see if our note.tag_IDs includes our tag.id. So if we just make sure that we import this use memo right here, just give it a second. There we go. What this line of code right here is saying is it's saying, hey, loop through all my different notes, and for each one of them, I want you to keep all of the information about the notes, but I also want you to get the tags that have the associated ID inside of our note that's being stored. Now, the last thing we need to do is make sure we only run this every time our notes or our tags gets updated, and that should fix those errors that we're having. But it looks like we're getting an error here with our tag IDs. So if we look at our raw note, you can see our raw note, we forgot to include our raw note data. There we go, that should fix this. So now all this information should be a part of our note, and that should get rid of this error, and it does. So now our notes with tags, you can see has all of our information about our tags, our ID, our title, and our markdown. And we don't really care about the tag IDs, but it's still there and something we can use. So now let's create a function that handles the creation of a note. We'll call this onCreateNote, and this is going to take in essentially some note data, which is going to be the type of note data. We know that this is what we're going to be using when we create a note. And what we want to do is we want to set our notes based on our previous notes. We want to return an array that has all of our previous notes, and we want to have our data as well, like this, but our note data is not a raw note. We want to convert this into a raw note, so instead of storing the tag itself, we just want to extract the ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this here to have our tags as well as all of the data for our note. And in here, what I want to do is I want to get all of the data, just like this, and then I want to set a specific ID, which in our case is going to be a UUID v4, which is a library we're going to install. npmi UUID, just like that. That's going to install this UUID library. And then up here, we can import v4 as UUID v4 from that UUID library. This just allows us to create a string-based ID that's always going to be unique. Now, the last thing we need to store is going to be our tag IDs. So we can take all of the tags that we have, and I want to map them, and I just want to get the tag.id. Essentially, I'm just extracting the ID from our tags, and now as you can see, that got rid of all of our errors for us, so we know that this should work. And now we have a function that when we create a note and call this function, it's going to save that inside of this note array right here, which is stored inside of our local storage. So now what we can do is we can scroll down quite a ways here to where we have our new note. And this is going to have an onSubmit that we're going to pass to it, and this onSubmit is going to be an onCreateNote. So now what we can do inside of this new note is we can make sure we accept an onSubmit. And this onSubmit is going to have the type of new note props. New note props. And this is going to have an onSubmit. And we already know that this onSubmit is a function. This function is going to take in some data, which is a note data, just like that. And it's going to return void. And now we can pass that to our note form, and that should clear up that final error that we've been having for a while. Now we do still have another error. If we scroll all the way up here, you can see it's saying that there's an error with this. Could not find the type declarations. We can call npm I save dev the types for this, and that'll install the types for UUID4, which is important to make sure we have all of our types like we should. So once that's done, now that should remove that error for us, which is exactly what we want. And now we can continue on with our project. The final thing we need to do before we can actually create a brand new note is to handle what happens when we actually create a brand new tag. So if we come into here, our creatable React select has an onCreate option function or property that we can pass here. And it's going to take in a label, which is the thing we type in, and then we need to do something with that label. And this means that we need to automatically set the value because it does not call on change when we create a new tag. Instead, it calls this function right here. So I want to get a new tag, which what I'm going to do is I'm going to set an ID equal to UUID v4, and then we're just going to set our label like this. I'm going to make sure I import this UUID v4. I'm going to copy the same import I used up here over into here. There we go. So now we have that, so we can create our ID. And I want to call a function called onAddTag. I'm going to pass in our new tag. We'll handle that function in a little bit, but I also want to set our selected tags to be this previous value as well as all of our tags here. So ... previous new tag. So we're just taking all of our existing tags and adding this new tag onto the end of our selected tags. Now you're probably wondering, why do I have this onAddTag right here? Well, the reason for that is because we want to be able to make sure that we can store that inside of our local storage, which is persisted in our application. So we need to handle a function for that. So back inside of our app here, let's just scroll down, function, add tag. This is going to take a tag just like this, and this is going to be a really straightforward function. We're just going to call set tags with the previous value, get all the previous ones, and add the other tag to the very end. And now we can pass that into our new note. So we can say onAddTag is equal to add tag. And I also want to pass in all the available tags that we have. So that's just going to be equal to our available tags just like that. So now what we can do inside of our new note is we can make sure we handle that information. So we have here onAddTag, which is going to be a function that takes in a tag and returns to us void. And then we have our available tags, which is going to be a tag array. And then we just need to make sure we import this type of tag. There we go. So now we can use those onAddTag, available tags, and these we just want to pass down directly into our Note form. There we go. And I'm just going to copy this type because it's going to be sharing a lot of information with our Note form up here. Paste that down, and let's get that onAddTag and available tags from our props. So now this onCreate option should work fine. We have our values, we have our onChange. All we need to do is set our options as well. These options are going to be coming from our available tags. And again, we just need to map through this to make sure that we actually are returning the correct format. So our label is tag.label and our value is our tag.id, just like that. So now with all of that done, we should actually have everything we need to store information. So if we just inspect our page real quick, and we go over to the application tab, you can see inside of local storage that we have this uppercase notes, which is an empty array, and we have this uppercase tags, which is again also an empty array. So we have no information at all being stored in our notes or in our tags. So let's see what happens if we create a brand new tag. If I just say new and hit enter, you can see immediately we have a new tag being added. And this new tag has an ID that's randomly generated, as well as the label of new. That worked just like I expected. Let's try creating a brand new note. We can say title is going to be test, and body is test body. And if I click save, you can now see in our note, we have a title that says test, our markdown says test body, our tag IDs is an empty array, so that's clearly not working. We need to fix that. And then our ID is properly generating itself. Now I already know why the tags are not working. That's because we never passed them along here. We just need to pass our selected tags along, and that should fix that problem. So now if we save this, and we just inspect our page real quick, and we just check this notes, if we click save again, you'll see we have another note, and this one properly does have our tag IDs being set to the ID for the brand new tag that we created. So that's working exactly like we expect it to. But you'll notice when we click save, it's not redirecting us anywhere. We should probably redirect the user, and we can do that really easily using a custom hook, which is called useNavigate. And let's make sure we import that custom hook, just like that. And then we can just say navigate, and we just want to navigate to the page that we were previously on, and that's just going to move us backwards one page whenever we do this. So if we just say new to new body, and I click save, it's now navigating me backwards, which in our case is just bringing us to the home page. So now with that done, let's actually go ahead and try to focus on the home page, which is going to be storing out our notes, because now that we can create notes, we can actually view those notes on our home page. So let's go back to our app TSX here. And what I want to do right here is I want to render out a note list. We'll just close that off. Now we can go and create a new component for that, note list.tsx, export function, note list. There we go. And we can just return h1 list. And now it should render out list to our screen as long as we make sure we import this component right here. There we go. There we go. It's printing out list. Okay, perfect. So now we can go back to our note list, and we want it to look essentially just like this. So we're going to have a part at the top for our searching, as well as this create and edit button. And then we're going to have the cards for our notes down here. What I want to do is I want to create this empty fragment here. And the first thing I want to do is create a row. And this row is going to be for our title, as well as these two buttons. And let's import that row. So inside of here, we're going to have a column. And this column is going to be in H1, which is going to say notes. So that's super straightforward right there. Next, we're going to have another column, and we're going to set the extra small size to auto. What that's going to do is it's just going to force the size of our column to be as small as possible to fit all of our content, which means that it's going to be pushed all the way to the right-hand side because this other notes column is going to take up the rest of the space. Now inside of here, I want to do a stack, which is something we're pretty familiar with. I want to add a gap of 2 inside of here, and our direction is going to be horizontal, just like that. Let's make sure that we import this stack component just like that. Now inside the stack, I want to have a link that's going to go to that create page. So a link, which is going to go to /new. And inside of here, I want this to actually be a button. So we're going to say button variant is primary, and it's going to say create just like that. Now let's make sure we import those components. So we have our link and we have our button. There we go. Now, if I give that a quick save and we come over here, you can see it says notes as well as this create button. Now, this edit tags is going to be a little bit more complicated because it's going to be opening in a modal, but for now we can at least create the button for it. And the button has a variant, which is going to be outline secondary. And it's going to say edit tags, just like that. Because as we know, when we click this, it's going to open this modal. So we're going to handle that in a little bit. But for now, we just have the button and it'll do nothing for now. The nice thing is when I click create, you can see it brings me to the create page. When I click cancel, it brings me back to the home page, which is exactly what we want. Now, the next thing I want to render out is going to be the form. And this form is going to be for all the information that you can see here for our title and for our tags. So let's just make sure we import that form. And inside of here, it's going to be a single row. I'm going to give it a class name of margin bottom 4, just to space it out from this section down here where we have our different notes. Now inside of our row, we're going to have a column. And this column is going to be for our very first form.group, which has a control ID of title. There we go. Now inside of this form group, I want to have a label, which is just going to say title. And then I want to have a form.control. And this form control is going to be a type of text. There we go. So now if we look over here, you can see we have our title showing up. Now I also want to have a section for our tags. I'm going to copy this almost exactly word for word from here because it's going to be very similar actually. So I'm just going to copy that. We can come over to here. Actually, I'm just going to copy the entire form group because it's going to be almost identical. Go back to our note list. I'm going to paste that down, and that's going to be in its own column, just like that. So paste that down, give it a save. And what I want to do, instead of using a creatable React select, I'm just going to use a normal React select. So import React select from React select, just like that. And that means that we don't have to worry about this on create option, so that we can completely remove. Otherwise though, all these different options are going to be things we need. We just need a way to store our selected tags, and we need to be able to pass in all of the different available tags that we're going to be using for our options. So up here, we're going to come in and we're going to take in our available tags. And we're also, I'm just going to copy this straight from here again, because why not? It's exactly the same. We're going to be getting our selected tags, and that's going to be coming from a use state. So we need to make sure that we import use state. We need to make sure that we import our tag type. So let's make sure we import that. And then we need to make sure we set a note list prop There we go. Type note list props, and it's going to be our available tags, which is just an array of tags. There we go. So now with all of that done, all these errors that we had down here should be gone. And if we come over to our app, we just need to make sure we pass in our available tags, which is just our tags like that. There we go. Perfect. So now you can see we have just our one tag because we currently only have one tag, but I can filter by that one tag. And the nice thing is I cannot create new tags. That's only allowed when we're creating new elements. And you can see I can filter and search all these different values. Now, since I've hooked up this, on change and value for our select, we should do the same thing for our title here. So value is title. On change, we're going to get that E element. And I'm just going to say that we're going to set the title to, set title to e.target.value, and that's going to be its own state title, set title, and that's going to be simply a string. So we can just leave that off like this. So now if we just scroll back down, all those errors are gone and everything is working exactly the same, but we have access to the value in the onChange event here. Now, before we move on to the next step, I'm just going to collapse this down, and on this row, I'm going to add some classes. We're going to say align items center and margin bottom 4, gives us some space and aligns our buttons in the center of our actual notes text. So now the next thing we need to do is to render out each one of these note cards right here. So we can do that fairly simply. What I can do is create a row, and this row, I want to say that based on the size of our screen, we should have more or less of these elements showing. So the number of columns we should have should change. So on an extra small screen, we should have 1 column. On a small screen, we should have 2. On a large screen, we should have 3. And on an extra larger screen, we should have 4 separate columns. And I'm also going to set a class name here of G3 to make sure we have a gap between these different rows of 3, which is just going to look really good. Now, the next thing I want to do is to loop through all of our different notes, but I only want to loop through the notes that are actually being filtered to by our filter right here. I'm going to loop through some filtered notes, which is a variable we're going to create in just a little bit. But essentially, I want to map through each one of these notes. Now, I want to return to us a column for each one of them that has a key, which is the ID of our note. And then inside this column, I want to render out our note card, which for now I'll just close off. We'll add the information to it in just a second. So we need to create this filtered notes. In order to do this, we need to first pass our notes in. So we're going to have notes that are coming in, which is a note array just like that. And this is going to be using useMemo. And our useMemo is going to update every time we change our title, our selected tags, or our notes, just like that. And inside of here, we want to return a filtered version of our notes. So we're going to filter through each one of our notes. And then we're just going to return essentially a big Boolean statement. So if our title is equal to an empty string, or if our note.title.toLowerCase includes our title.toLowerCase, then what we're saying right here is that essentially we have a match. So if our title is blank, that means we haven't typed in a title, so don't do anything. Otherwise, check to see if our note has that exact title in it. Let's import useMemo while we're at it. So this takes care of all of our title stuff, but I want to do another check for our tags. So we want to check to make sure our tags and our titles match. Let's make sure we import the note up here as well. There we go. So for this one, I'm going to do almost the exact same thing. So if our selected tags.length is equal to 0, then that's fine. We don't want to do any matching. Otherwise, if it's not, we're going to check our selected tags. We're going to make sure that every single one of those tags is going to be a tag that's inside of our note.tags. So we can check our note tags to see if some of them include this exact tag. So this is our note tag. Our note tag.id is equal to our tag.id. So I'm going to explain this one function in a little bit because it's kind of complicated. So essentially the way this works is we're saying loop through all of our selected tags and make sure that every single one of them returns true for this statement. And this statement says, check our note to see if it contains the tag we're looping through. So all this line of code is doing is just checking to make sure our note has all of the tags that we're searching for. For example, if I search for CSS, you can see we get both of these, but if I narrow it down to have new as well, you can see we only get this one element, and that's essentially how this function's working. It's making sure all of the tags match, not just one of them. So now let's get rid of all that filtering, and we can scroll down here to our note card, and you can see that our note card essentially has a couple different parts. First of all, we need to be able to click on it, so we need to have access to the ID, We also need the title and we need the tags. So I could say the ID is our note.id, the title is our note.title, and we have our tags, which is our note.tags. So now let's create a function for our note card. And we know that our note card is going to take in some props. Those are ID, title, and tags. And this is essentially just a note object. But we don't want a full note. We want a simplified note because we don't care about the markdown portion. So let's create the type for our simplified note. Type simplified note equals, and the simplified note is going to have an array of tags. It's going to have a title, and it's going to have an ID, just like this. And here, we don't really care about our notes being anything but a simplified version of the note because we only care about the properties of ID, title, and tags, just like that. So now inside of our note card, what we can do is we can just simply return an H1 that says hi, just to make sure everything is working. And if we come over into our page, it looks like not quite everything's working because our note list is not passing down our notes. There we go. Now if we pass down our notes, you can see it prints out hi 3 times because we have 3 separate notes that we have created. We are getting an error though because we actually want our notes with tags. That's going to be a slightly different style of note, and that's going to get rid of that error for us. So now we can actually move over back into where we are working in our note list and finalize our note card. So our note card is going to be using the Bootstrap card. So we're just going to import that card right here. And inside of our card, we're going to need to have a body as well. And I'm going to add a few different things to our card. First of all, I want to make this a link. So I'm going to say that it's going to be as a link. I'm going to set the to property to be equal to here, a string interpolation. And that string interpolation is just going to be our ID property. So we can link to the specific note, essentially the show page. And then I'm going to add a bunch of classes onto this. And these classes are going to be fairly complex because we're going to have H100. That means it's going to fill the full height. We're going to have a text reset that's going to reset the color of our text back to the normal color because as a link, the text changes to blue. We don't want that. Also, our text decoration is going to be none. And then the final complex style is going to be styles.card. And this is going to be coming from CSS modules because if we want to have these fancy hover styles, we can only do that inside of CSS. So we're going to be using CSS modules for that. So what we can do is we can just come in here. We're going to create a new file called notelist.modules.css. And inside of here, I just want to have some really simple styles for our card. So we're going to have our card, and then we're going to have a hover style as well as a focus style. So what we're going to do is we're going to translate 0 and -5 pixels. That's just going to lift our note up 5 pixels. And then we're going to add a box shadow. This box shadow is going to be 0 in the X and Y direction, down by 5 pixels. It's going to have an 8 pixel blur, 0 pixel spread, and it's going to be a black color that is mostly transparent. And then what we can do inside of our card is we can just make sure we specify a transition on our translate property, which is ease in out over 100 milliseconds. And the same thing for box shadow. We want this to be ease in out over 100 milliseconds. Now, in order to use CSS modules, we need to import them. So at the very top here, we can say that we want to import. We can get rid of this note input since we're not actually using that anymore. We want to import styles from, and this is going to be from /notelist.modules.css. And now, when we actually use that styles dot all the way down here, .card, it's going to get that card class from our modules.css right here. Now you will notice we're still getting an error. That's because this should say module.css, not modules. And up here, when we do our import, it should say module. That should get rid of that error down here. And as you can see, it has. Now, if we go back over to our application, just make sure we save everything. It says failed to resolve this file, notelist.module.css, notelist.txs. Let's see, notelist.module.css. Oh, it's because this should be called notelist, not noteslist. There we go. Now, if we give it a refresh, that should hopefully fix it. And now when we hover over these, you can see we get that hover style being applied, which is exactly what we want. So now we can focus on putting the content inside of our cards. So inside of our card body, let's use a stack with a gap of 2. And if we just look over here, you can see we're stacking our title on top of our different tags. And we're going to give them some classes to get everything centered on our screen. So we can do align items, center, justify content, center, and H100, again, to make sure it fills the full height. Now inside of our stack, we're going to have a span, which is going to have a class name of FS5 to give it a larger font size. and we're going to put our title inside of there. So now if we just save this, come over here, you can see we have our 3 different titles showing up, which is exactly what we want. And now we need to loop through each one of our tags. So if our tag's length is greater than 0, then what we need to do is we need to create a stack. And this stack is going to be a horizontal stack with a small gap of 1. So we can say horizontal right here. Class name is going to be justify content center flex wrap. And now we just need to style each one of our tags. And we should also close off our stack. So for each one of our tags, the styling that we want to do here, tags.map for each tag. And whoops, let's just make sure we do parentheses like that. So we can do a badge, badge, which we're going to need to make sure that we import. So let's just close that off. Badge like that. Make sure that we import this. And we can give it a key, which is our tag.id. Our tag.label is going to go inside of it. And then we can give it a simple class name of text truncate, just to make sure if we have really long text, it's not going to overflow the actual container. So now if we save that, and we just come back over here, you can see that our tags are showing up at the bottom just like we want them to, so it looks really good. Let's create a brand new one actually. We'll just call this new2. We're going to give this a tag of new and another, give it some body, and let's just make sure this is actually Markdown. So we'll just title some text. There we go. Save. Now you can see we have 2 tags and that looks exactly like we want it to. And when we click on these, it brings us to the show page, which is really good. That's what we want. So now that we have the majority of this page done, we have our filtering working properly, we can click on these to go to the show page. We should probably work on the actual show page as well as the edit page because they share some similarities between them. So over here, you noticed that we wrapped our pages inside this route right here. Well, we can actually give this an element, and this is an element that's going to wrap both of our other components. We're going to call it our note layout, and we're going to pass it in all of our notes. So let's say notes with tags, and let's just close that off. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because we want to get the individual note based on the ID. So we're going to pass it in all of our notes. We're going to get the exact note with the given ID, and then we're going to pass that down to both of the show and the edit route. So let's create that note layout.tsx. There we go. Export note layout. Make sure that's a function. And we know that this is going to take in some notes. And this is going to be our note layout props. And we're just going to say type note layout props equals notes is just going to be a note array. And let's make sure we import that from our app. There we go. Now this note layout is going to be very simple. First, we want to get the ID, which we can use the useParams custom hook from React Router to do. That's going to get us the ID straight from our URL. And again, if you're unfamiliar with some of these more advanced React Router concepts, I have a full tutorial on it. Again, it'll be linked in the cards and description for you. So now I want to get the note. So we can say notes.find where the ID is equal to our ID, just like this. So whatever ID we're trying to go to, search through all of our notes and see if you can find a note with that exact ID. If there is no note, so if, for example, our note equals null, then we want to return a navigate component, which will just allow us to navigate back to the page we came from. So we're going to navigate to the home page here, and we're going to pass in replace here. And that's just going to make sure it replaces that URL. So when we click the back button, it doesn't bring us back to this page that doesn't even exist. Now with that done, we can return an outlet, which again is straight from React Router, and that's just going to render out whatever is inside of this component. So here it's going to render out one of these 2 routes. And then what we can do inside this outlet is we can pass it a context, and that context can contain our note. So now inside of each one of those different routes, we can actually get that context information. So I'm just doing all my imports here to make sure we get all this information imported. And now if I save all of these, we should see that nothing at all changes. And when I click on test, for example, it still goes to the show page because it's rendering out this outlet. If I try to go to an ID that doesn't exist, you can see it redirects me back to the home page just like we want. That's what this line of code right here is doing. Now I'm going to add one little helper function, and this function is going to be called useNote. This useNote function is going to return useOutlet context, and it's going to give us a type of note. Note, just like that. And this useOutletContext function is a function that you use inside of the outlets. So inside of any of the routes that are inside this layout, you can use that and it's going to give you all the information from our context. So all we're doing is creating this super nifty helper function that allows us to just do this line of code wherever we need to without writing it all out. So we can create a brand new component now for handling the show page of our note. We're just going to call that note.tsx. And inside of here, the very first thing I can do is I can get my note by calling that useNote function, just like that. And let's just make sure I import this function. There we go. So now let's render out what our show page looks like. We'll just go to here as an example. So return, get some fragments going. There we go. And the first thing I want to do is I want to have a row, which is going to have my title as well as my tags and my different buttons. So this is going to have a class name of align items center and margin bottom 4. Then inside the row, we're going to have a column, just like this. I'm going to make sure I get all these different imports. There we go. So inside this first column, what I want to do is I want to have an H1 that's just going to say note.title. That's going to be the title of our page. Then below that, I want to have a stack. So if our note.tags.length is greater than 0, then what I want to do is render out a stack that's going to render a badge for each one of those notes. It's going to be very similar to what we did on our note list. So I'm just going to copy this directly because again, it's almost identical. There we go. Copy that, paste that down here. But instead of it saying tags, it needs to say note.tags, just like that. So let's get our stack. We can get that imported. We can change some of our class names here. We don't need to justify this in the center. We just want to wrap it. So don't worry about the centering of it. That'll be perfect. Otherwise, this is good. Let's import this badge. And now if I save and I go to our show page, give it a quick refresh, you'll see it's still not showing up exactly as we want it to. And that's because we're not actually showing this note component. So here, instead of rendering our show, we should render out the note component. Let's just make sure we do a quick import of this. There we go. Now, if we save, you can see it says new to, and it has both of our tags shown below it, just like it would over here. Now, the next thing I need to render is a column for my buttons. Again, it's going to be very similar to what we did in our note list. So I'm just going to scroll all the way up to our row. I'm going to copy this column because we're going to have a lot of shared components here. On our note page, after this column, let's add a new column. It has extra small here set to auto, which is good. It's going to have an edit, a delete, and a back button. Again, we're going to use a stack, and we're going to make sure we import this link and button component so we have access to all of these different pieces of information that we're going to need. There we go. Now this very first link is going to be for edit. So we're going to have it go to a URL that is going to say /note.id. And then we want it to go to /edit, just like that. And this button is going to be the primary button that is going to say edit. Now below that, we're going to have a button. This one's going to be outline danger. And this one is going to say delete. And it's going to have some on click, but we're not going to worry about that right now. And then we're going to have a secondary button here. And the secondary button is going to say back, and this one is just going to navigate us backwards. So again, it's going to be a link. So this link is just going to go to the backwards page, or we can just go directly to the home page if we would prefer. So now, just like that, if we come over here, you can see we have our edit, our delete, and back. So we click back, it goes back to this page, which is perfect. Click edit, it brings us to the edit page, and delete right now just does nothing. Now the final thing we need to do is to render out our Markdown. So to do that, we're going to use a library called React Markdown, which just makes handling Markdown in React incredibly easy. And we can just use the component it gives us, which is called React Markdown. And we can pass it in our note.markdown, just like that. And we just need to make sure that we import this component. Looks like it's not letting me auto import that. That's fine. We can just come up here, import from React Markdown. There we go. So now that should work just fine. And our actual code should show up as Markdown. As you can see, it has the title and it has our text. Now I probably want to add a little bit of space for this because it doesn't look like there's any space between our different rows. The reason for this is I spelled class name incorrectly. So now if I save, you can see that got all of our spacing and our alignment correct. And now this is working. So if I go to a different note, you can see it has our information and each one of our notes works perfectly fine. And it works fine with Markdown, as you can see here. So now let's work on editing our note. And that's going to be very similar to our new note. So I'm actually just going to copy that and call it edit_note.tsx. And everywhere I have the word new, I'm going to change that to say edit. So we have our edit note props, edit note props. And right here, this should say edit note instead. And then what we can do is make sure when we go over to our app.tsx, here we can pass in our edit note. Now our edit note is going to have almost the exact same properties as our new note, but instead of doing a create note here, we're going to want to have an on update note that we're going to pass in instead. Otherwise, our tags and such are going to be exactly the same. So let's import that here and let's create that function on update note. And this update function is going to take in an ID, which is going to be a string, as well as all of our data for our tags and the rest of our note. So that is going to be our note data, just like that. So it's going to work very similar to create, but we're going to pass it the ID of the thing we actually want to update. Otherwise, our set note here is going to be very, very similar. So I'm just going to copy that down. So what we're going to do here, instead of adding a brand new note, is we're going to return our previous notes, and we want to map through each one of our notes. And we want to check if our note.id is equal to our current ID. Otherwise, we just return our current note. But if our note ID is the same, then we want to return a brand new note. And that's just going to take a lot of this information from right here. So I'm just going to kind of paste that up and then delete all that code down there. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all of our original note data. We're going to pass that in just fine. Then we're going to take our new data, overwrite it, as well as we're going to not have to pass it an ID, so we can get rid of that. But we do need to take our tag IDs, which come with that tag.id property. So we're just converting our tags to IDs, saving all of our existing data, and overwriting with our new data. So that is our on update function. And as you can see, that looks like this is getting rid of our errors, but our on submit is slightly different. So in our edit note, we need to change the formula here to have an ID, which is a string. And that means we can't directly pass our on submit in like this. Instead, we need to take the data that this passes out to us. We need to call on submit, which is going to have our note.id as well as our data. And to get our note, we can get that from that context we created earlier. So we can say note equals use note. And if I import that, import that, you can see that that should get rid of all of our different errors and everything is going to work just fine. Give this a quick refresh and you can see it showing up. When we click edit, you can see we're on the edit page for our note, but it's not pre-filling any of our information. Obviously, we need to work on that next. So to do that, we need to pass in a title, which is going to be our note.title. We need to pass in our markdown, which is our note.markdown, and our tags, which is our note.tags. This is going to be like our initial default data that we use, but of course we don't have this inside of our note form. So if we go to our note form, what we can do is we can take our props and we can add in all of the props for our note itself. And this is going to be for our note data. Now this technically is going to work for our edit note, but the problem is it's not going to work for our new note because we don't pass any of that data in. So we want to make it optional to pass that type of data in. So what we're going to do is we're just going to say that this is a partial note data. So this is saying we can pass in any of the properties of note data, but none of them are required. All of them are going to be optional. So now you can see we have no more errors, which is great. And we have access to these different properties. So we have access to a title, which is going to be an empty string. We have access to markdown, which is going to be an empty string. And we have access to our tags, which is going to be an empty array by default. So these are all the three different properties we added to our note form props. And now what we need to do is by default, we can set our tags to our tags that we pass in here. And our markdown and title, we can actually just come down here and give them a default value, which is going to be title. And if we go a little bit further down to our markdown, we can say default value is markdown, just like that. So now you can see our default values are all filling in, which is great. And let's say I remove the new tag here and I add some more text and I click save. You can see that it brought us back to this page, which is perfect. You can see it removed that tag and it added my more text. So it's automatically working exactly as we want. And if we go back, we should still be able to create a brand new one. And if we do, you can see that that's showing up again just fine. Now, if we go back to our page for our show, you can see that everything's working except for this delete button. So let's implement the delete button. We need to create a function for handling delete. So we'll just come up here, function on delete note. It's going to take in a string for the note we want to delete. And I'm just going to take all of my notes and I'm going to return previous notes and I want to filter through each one of my notes. I'm going to check where the ID is not equal to the ID we pass in. This is just going to give me all of the notes except for the one that I want to delete based on this ID. We can pass this into our note show page, just like this. we can say on delete note is going to be this. And I'm just going to call this on delete because it's self-explanatory. It is a note. So now if we move to our note, we need to be able to accept in that on delete, which is coming from our note props. So, whoops, that prop right here on delete, this is going to be a function which has an ID, which is a string, and it returns to us nothing at all. So now we can actually use this on delete function. So when we click on this delete button, we want to call that function. So we're going to call on delete, and I also want to navigate us back to the page that we were on before. And to do that, I'm just going to say we're going to navigate to the slash page here, and on delete is going to be our note.id. Now to get this navigate, again, we can get it from the custom hook, use navigate, which again comes directly from React Router, just like that. So now we can actually navigate back. So if I just save this and I click the delete button, this test with the test body should be gone. So you can see this is this one right here, click delete. You can now see that that one is completely gone and it works as we expect. Let's get rid of this one, delete, and now it is gone. So right now we have everything in our app done except for this edit tags button. We need to be able to delete tags and edit the text inside of them because right now we have no way to do that. So let's go back over to our notes list here. So notes list, and in here is where we have the button for editing our tags. And this button, we just want to toggle essentially a modal. So we can just add a modal down here, which we'll call our edit tags modal. Make sure I spell that correctly. We'll just close that off for now. And again, spell all that correctly. And down here, we can create that function edit tags modal, just like that. We can just return modal for now, and it'll just show up at the bottom of our page. Now, obviously we want to make this an actual modal, and Bootstrap makes that fairly easy. So we're going to use this modal component here coming from React Bootstrap. So let's import that. And inside of this modal, we're going to have a header portion. So inside the modal header, we're going to make sure it has a close button inside of it, and it's just going to have a title, .title, and that's going to say edit tags. There we go. Now the next thing that we need to do is give it a body, just like that. And inside the body, we're going to use a form because this form is going to be for editing all the different inputs inside of our tags. So with our form, we want to give it a stack on the inside, and the stack is going to have a gap of 2. Close that off. And inside of here, we want to just loop through all of our tags. So we have our available tags. So we want to map through those available tags. And for each tag, we essentially want to render out an individual row. And if we look over here, this is what we want this to look like. If I click on this, you can see we have an input where we can modify this. And as you can see, it updated it. Or we can click delete, and it's just going to remove that tag from everything. So we want to do that inside of a row, which has a key, which is our tag.id. Close that off. And now we're going to have a column. And we're going to essentially have 2 columns. The first column is going to be for this longer section, and the second one is going to be for our button, which we want to be auto-sized, so we'll say extra small auto. And this one's really easy. It's just going to be a button, which has the variant of outline, danger, and inside of here, we're going to have the text of @times, or ampersand times. That's just going to give us an X button, essentially. So that's exactly what we want for that. And we can handle the onClick in just a second. Also, we need to make sure we pass in our available tags. So we're just going to make sure that's up here, which is what we want. And now inside of this column right here, we need a form, .control. There we go. And I just need to get rid of all this extra code because this is going to be self-closing. It's going to have a type of text, a value, which is our tag.label. And then we're going to have an update function on it, which we're going to create in just a second. So now, if we just give this a quick save, everything should be working. We just need to make sure we hook up all of our different types. Also, this modal needs to have a show property, and it needs to have an onHide property as well, which we'll just call handle close. So we can pass in here our handle close as well as our show, and this is going to be our edit tags modal props. So let's create that type. I'm going to scroll way up here. Type edit tags modal props. Show is a Boolean that's true or false. Available tags is just going to be an array of all of our different tags. Pretty straightforward. And then we're going to have our handle close. This one is going to be a function that just returns void. It doesn't take anything, and it is going to return nothing for us. So now, where we have this edit tags modal, we need to pass it in our show property. We need to pass it in the handle close property. And finally, we need to pass it in our available tags as well. So to handle our show and close, we're just going to use a simple state. So we can say edit tags modal is open, set edit tags modal is open. And that's just going to be a use state that by default is set to false, so it's not open by default. And then we can pass in this for our show, and we can take our set. So whenever we do a close, we're just going to set this here to false, so it is no longer open anymore. And then we need our button. Our button is all the way up here in this top row. For edit tags, on click, we need to set it up an event listener, so it's going to call this function and pass in true. So when we click that button, it's going to open this modal. As you can see here, when we click the X, or when we click outside of it, it's going to close it. So that's working fine, but we can't edit or delete any of these yet, so we need to add functionality for that. So let's go back to our app TSX. Scroll up here, we already have a function for add. Let's add an update tag function, which takes an ID, and it takes a label. And we're going to have a delete tag function, which takes an ID. Now these are very similar to these other functions we've used. So for example, instead of set notes, it'll be set tags. Just like that. This is going to be our previous tags. And for each one of our tags, we want to check to see if the ID has changed. That's how we're going to do our delete. Our update, again, is going to be very similar. I'm just going to, I won't copy it. We'll write it out by hand. So inside of here, we'll say set tags. We're going to get our previous tags. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn our previous tags mapped over each one of the tags. If the tag.id is equal to our ID, we'll do one thing. Otherwise, we'll just return the tag as is. There we go. And up here, we're going to return all the properties for our tag, but we're just going to change the label. That's the only thing that's going to change. So now we can pass this update and delete down into the note list. So here we have our update tag and we have our delete tag. We're going to pass both of those in. Whoops. Just like that. But of course, these are not accepted yet because we don't have the types for those listed here. So inside of our note list props, we need to have that delete tag and update tag properties. And I'm actually going to slightly change this to say on delete and on update just because I like the naming better. So delete is going to take an ID, which is a string, and return to us void. And here update is going to be very similar, but it's also going to take a label, which is a string. Otherwise, it's going to be the same. These same properties need to be able to be passed to our edit modal here. So now what we can do is we can say on update, on delete, and we can pass those down into our edit modal. On update, tag. There we go. On delete tag, on delete tag. Perfect. Those are being passed in now. And down here, we can actually use them. On delete, on update. There we go. So that should hopefully fix all of our errors. We just need to make sure that this says on update and on delete. Now, if we go back into our note list, we can just hook up those functions we just created. So whenever we click on, or whenever we edit here, our value, we can say on change. This is going to get our event. And I want to call on update tag, pass in our tag ID, and our new label, which is our target.value. And then on our button here, our on click is just going to call the delete function for us. So we can say on delete tag, pass it in our tag.id. And that right there should be everything we need to do. So when we click edit tags, I can change another to another 2. And you can see that that is updated right here. And let's say I want to get rid of that tag, click delete. You can see it has deleted that tag and it's no longer in this list of tags here. And that right there is a full advanced TypeScript React project. Now, if you want to see another advanced project on nested comments, it's going to be linked over here. It's essentially a Reddit clone. Or if you want to deep dive into React Router even further, that's going to be linked over here. Now, with that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.